Oh. There's your QR code in case anybody hasn't scanned in. So I posted your first announcements. I posted your exam, your second Pearson exam, the one that I'm counting as a sort of a redo of the first one. That's going to be due Sunday. Again, you'll just average your first and second attempts together. Even if you missed it, still, I think I sent this message clear, but you know, a zero is a heck of a lot worse than even an F. Okay, so people who got Fs, you can get it up to maybe a C or a B and be in arm's reach for an A at the end of the course. So let's see here. So we're moving on to a section that's very dear to me. It got me into these kind of topics, actually, what motivated me to become an economist. A lot of my work in China and abroad has been focusing on issues that are central to these topics. So I've got a lot I could say about a lot of this. The chapters we'll cover. Okay, there'll be some type of Pearson work, but I'm just maybe repeating some things, but the slides that we'll be offering here are going to be your main source because there'll be a lot of material not covered in the textbook. And on your next exams and everything, I'll be pulling out of these slides. So I'll introduce you to a lot of concepts that were just sort of like footnotes in the textbook. And there's a lot of research being done at Harvard and other places. And I'll sort of open the door and show you some of the current stuff that's going on. And hopefully by the end of this course, or by the end of the section, you'll have an understanding at least of the different, I guess, the topology of a more complete topology of the arguments about what's happening in the global stage. I'll leave the opinions about things, about what should be done policy-wise and things like that, open the door to whatever your interpretations are. I'm not here to try to push a certain interpretation, but I'm just trying to open up the door so you can understand what at least the discussion is about. Okay, so let's go to start this. So I will have to say that for these next few lectures, and I'm sorry, but these will be more traditional lecture style because there's not textbooks, there's not other types of materials. This is, you can think about this as I'm trying to pass a lot of this on in an oral tradition. So this is going to be a little bit more old school in terms of lecturing and that sort of thing. Okay, so the overall topic we're trying to look at is this topic of growth, business cycles. In this chapter, we'll introduce you to the importance of the financial sector and how that sort of plays in. Those are the big topics here. Yeah, growth, again, we're looking at long run economic growth. Remember, you all calculated growth rates. So in your projects, you calculated growth rates, and those were quarterly, right? Those growth rates over very short periods of time. And those are just these percentage changes. You can think about them from period to period. But it turns out that there's actually a much longer run story when we're talking about growth. And that's really going to be sort of the trend line that GDP is on. You know, GDP over a longer period of time follows a trend. A slope, you can think of a line almost, and the slope of that line being the trend. You know, some are going very steep long-term trends, some are flatter, some are maybe totally flat. And it's about trying to understand some of those longer-term trends. Now, investments, financial systems, in this kind of a way, we're going to look at how do these play in to those growth. And primarily we'll look at investment, this investment vehicle as a driver of growth. And also of the business cycle. Actually, the investment cycle and the business cycle are very much related. So these are all interconnected ideas. One thing that's not on here that we are covering very sort of peripherally, but also importantly, is this concept of trade, of economic trade. And part of that is really rooted in the idea that growth is driven by technology. Okay, and so how does it relate to trade? Well, you know, trade and also foreign direct investment, those kind of vehicles are ways that countries gain access to global pools of knowledge in production. It's a way that they gain access to technologies that they don't necessarily produce within their own borders. And technology is the thing that drives us forward. So trade is a very much important part of this discussion. It's missing here. So you see, this is the Pearson part of the slide. And part of my grievances towards this section, which I'll be addressing. So as you know, we start off, I'm going to start off with first looking at measurements. These are all things you need to know about how to calculate. We've done some of these things, okay? So I tried to prep you in your last assignments and things. You get growth rates. You should know how to do a growth rate at the back of your hand, okay? Hopefully by now. Average growth rates. So average growth rates, you all know how to do averages. You just add things up and divide by however many number of things you added up. 3 numbers you add up, you just add the 3 numbers, divide by 3. That's an average. Looking at these kind of longer term trends in growth. So if you noticed, if you caught a hint that this is very much, these are international kind of related topics, right? How does one country grow more than the other? Why are some countries rich, other countries poor, right? These have a very international type of flavor to it. So, you know, we need to think about these measurements as being internationally comparable. And so there'll be we'll need to stop and pause there because there are what's called things like scale effects. Some countries are bigger than small countries, right? So if we just look at GDP, yeah, the US has like a lot more GDP than a country like Cuba or one of the small island nations, right? So we'll need to think about how to, what they call normalize our metrics so that they're comparable. And a lot of that's done actually by looking at GDP per capita. That's just, I'll give you the jump right there. You can look at production per person, output per person as a metric. That's called normalizing. Then you can compare how much per person to how much per person. It starts to make more comparable sense across borders. There's all kinds of ways to normalize. That's just our main one. Oh, I say it right there, okay. Okay, so the big trends again, the long run economic growth, and then in the short run, the business cycle. In the business cycle, we studied in the US, you know, we had the great inflation, you know, the great moderation. You get these 2008, you know, financial crises. You know, you get different types of recessionary periods, the dot-com bust. The economy is constantly sort of moving through these cyclical periods of recessions and expansions. That's the business cycle. It's in a very short run sort of time frame. And we're going to study the evolution of the economy through business cycles. That's going to be on the business cycle part. And then on the growth side, I've already kind of talked about it. We're going to look at sort of long run growth determinants and the effects on standard of living and other types of things. So more on calculation. You all should be able to do this, I would imagine, by now. Okay, I'm not going to go into detail. This is just a percentage change formula with your nice little Pearson multiplied by 100, which I never do. But tests and things. So we're not going to calculate that. Averages, we already talked about this. You got several growth rates, right? And so you calculate the growth rates in different periods. You can already kind of imagine how this might play out on a Pearson test, right? It could give you GDP for many different years. I guess you calculate the growth rates, and then what's the average growth rate over a certain period? You're just averaging those growth rates. It's just straightforward, right? I'm not going to go to that. Okay, a nice thing about growth rates too is if you know the growth rates, you can actually, this is another thing, you can actually figure out what the GDP is in the next period. All right. So if you have the previous real GDP, it grew by a certain amount, this growth rate, add 1 to it. Say that to the T power, that's just like how long it grew by that period. How many periods did it grow at that rate? Okay. But if it's just one period, that's just to a power of 1. That's nothing. So the next year's GDP could be calculated using the previous year's and then multiplying it by 1 plus the growth rate from that period, if that makes sense. We can run through an example of this. This is pretty straightforward calculation, but I mean, like look, straightforward. If I had a 5% growth rate, right? My GDP was 100. What's my GDP in the second period? What's 105? Obviously, right? How did I get that? It's just 1 plus my growth rate in decimal form, not Pearson form. 0.5. Right? If I grew by 5% for 3 years, actually the formula would be 100 times 1 plus 0.05, now to the power of 3 years. Okay, that would be my GDP after 3 years of growing at 5%. And you did this kind of thing in your project. That's why I pushed you. You actually could have solved those questions a lot easier than the way that I gave you by just looking at differences between Q2 in 19 and Q2 in 2021. You could have skipped a lot of steps, but I pushed you through the methodology because it ties in and because you can get, you see, I had a bigger picture in mind for you by putting you through that. To give you an intro here. So this isn't like that much news. There's a nice thing, actually, this is a rule of 70 you probably haven't seen. There's a typo on your original slides. I'll show you what it is, but you can use this rule of 70 to figure out how many years it takes to double based upon a certain growth rate. So you see that it's just the 70 divided by the growth rate. So if I grow, this is the example, this is where there's a typo, is if I grow at 5%, how many years would it take for me to double? Well, 70 divided by 5, 14 years. See? This is, I'm gonna put this into some perspectives for us. We're gonna do this in just a minute, looking at growth rates from different countries. And we'll see the years to doubling being very drastically different. This is a very handy one. The typo you had is that this was a 4 here. This 5 was actually a 4. 70 divided by 4 is not 14, okay? There's a typo there. Oops. So with those different growth rates in mind, I just wanted to give us a global perspective now at, and this is 2018, before our last COVID crisis. And just taking a snapshot of the world in different growth rates. And what do you notice? What do you see?
A lot of green.
Yeah, well, okay, so first off, greens and blues are real strong growth. The lighter the green, the slower the growth, darker the green, you're getting high growth. If you're in the blues, you are up to almost double-digit growth. And then also looking at the negatives, if you're light pale, you're almost at zero, all the way down to dark red's bad, and gray's no data. So what do you notice about like which areas are really growing the fastest in this picture? A lot of countries in Asia, right? Look, you got China, Mongolia. There's let's see here. You get Vietnam. Okay. So there's a lot of India, a lot of the Southeast Asian region has high growth rates in 2018. Now, if I was going to throw it in, let's say, so China slowed, I'll say from 18, prior to 18, actually China was in double-digit growth. So China had some explosive growth through the 2000s. You know, since the turn of the new millennia, China's gone through some tremendous growth. It's incredible actually to live in a place where it's experiencing high growth, something you all may never experience. I was lucky to see it firsthand. It's actually visually I would call China actually Beijing. I would call an amnesia city because I would literally go somewhere and come back and it would be so different I wouldn't recognize it within like a month or two. And I mean, I'm talking about like places I'd go to eat. The funny thing is in China, they sometimes, when I was there, their building standards weren't always up to snuff, and the brand new building would already start to like have pieces falling off of it, and some types, and plus all of the industrial pollution. You have to have some falling off like parts, and then you have industrial pollution that puts a nice heavy layer of soot on everything, a nice thick black layer of soot. And then it rains, and then all that soot turns into these black streaks that come down the building. And very quickly, you've got falling off parts and stained buildings that look extremely old. They look 20 years old when you first look. So I'm eating at a place that I eat every day, and then I go back to the US for a break, and I come back like a month later to my place I've been eating at every day, and it's not a little building anymore. Now there's this like gigantic like building in a parking lot right where I was, and it looks like it's 20 years old. And I go, I swear I'm not crazy. I ate here. This is weird. And you have like, you have developments of 100 buildings that are all 30, 40 stories going up at the same time. And that's a neighborhood. I come back to my place where I grew up in Redmond, which also experienced a lot of growth, but Redmond, Washington, home of Microsoft. And you know, my things change a lot slower there. My friends, oh yeah, it's changed so much. You know, we got a new, we got a couple new like buildings downtown. It's like okay, guys, you haven't seen like the real like to see something so expansively changing. It's kind of phenomenal to watch. Our growth in the U.S. is a lot slower. You notice, also through Europe. I'm not sure you see that pattern. Europe's a lot slower. Where else do you see fast growth? Yeah, in Africa. It's actually kind of interesting. You see a lot of growth in these countries that were not, so there's this idea of catching up. And we're gonna stop, and I'd like you to stop and think about why do you see this high growth rates in these countries that are underdeveloped currently? Part of it is, I'll just give you the spoiler, is that when you're underdeveloped for a long period of time, and then you go through a period of opening up, and this is where trade and foreign direct investment come in, then you get an influx of new technologies, access to new technologies, and so your growth just goes off on steroids. In the US, we've developed technology sequentially from the Industrial Revolutionary days, right? Every step was made sequentially. So we built up this big body of technology, there's all this development, and then all of a sudden, imagine a country that didn't do that, and then they open up, and then it's like, okay, now they get an influx of all the brand newest stuff. And there's actually even this idea what's called leapfrogging, which is what's happened in China in different industries, where it's not just that they get the access, so they get to adopt the newest stuff. So like, for instance, our steel mills were developed to have extremely large capacities, and they were developed in a time when that kind of scale made sense. Now, to make a steel mill takes a huge amount of capital investment. These kind of projects have incredibly long break-even points in time. You have to sometimes make a whole power plant just to power the steel mill. They're huge in capital investment. So once you lock in that technology, you're locked in. We got locked in our steel production. And when China opens up, they get to look at all the different types of production capacities, and they say, okay, we'll pick the best one now. You see, so they actually get to, in some ways, that's why they can make steel up, and partly why they can make it a lot cheaper than we can. It's because they got to have the benefit of making selections of the newest technology, and in that way, they kind of jumped over us in some ways. So you get that happening, and sometimes also you get leapfrogging where they take the best stuff and then they make it even a little better, and then now they've got something better than what we have, which is like their mobile payment systems of things. Like you don't carry a wallet in China. This is from the cave era. You know, you just walk around with your phone, and I can give you money or give you money, and everything is on the. You give the beggar in China money with a phone on the street. They have a little QR code. You're like, ching, give you some cash. It's like just like that. So there's leapfrogging. This is a nice picture. It shows you a lot. There's a lot of stories here. So take all these patterns in. Again, we'll be establishing some kind of patterns and then trying to also explain why some of these happen. So getting back to our measurement of per capita GDP. So that was looking at growth rates. Now we can look at per capita GDP. Okay, Zoom. Hey, guys on Zoom, if you don't see my screen, would you please yell at me? I'm saying, like, look at the countries and the colors of the green and the colors of this and that. You don't see that, just yell at me and say, hey, I don't see that. Okay, so before we looked at GDP growth, now I'm just looking at GDP in levels. Okay, actually not levels, I think this is per capita. So again, we divide by GDP per person to make cross-country comparisons. And now what do you see? Now you see a little different picture, right? So in terms of per capita GDP, where's wealth concentrated? Yeah, exactly. We get North America with the US and Canada, Europe, Australia. Nice thing about this is it gives you a slider. You can see from in 2009 what the world looked like. You can look at 1960. Now, no data on a lot of points. Where was the wealth concentrated in 1960? Same places, isn't it? Right? I see, like, it looks like the same almost picture. It's a little less extreme. So over here we were over 67,000. And it looks like when we fast forward time, we've dropped down a notch. Okay. But the pattern, and Canada's dropped down, you know, from different, I guess it depends on where you go. Yeah, Canada's dropped down. But the patterns are fairly stable, which brings us to our first sort of development question about so if you notice, most of the world, it's not rich. So you should see out of this, all of the continent, and here we have the continent of South America, Central America, Africa, through the Middle East. Well, the Middle East is oil, and it's a little bit of its own thing. But a lot of the countries within the Middle East, and even into Eastern Europe, old Soviet blocs, Turkey, different parts of Southeast Asia, all through the South Pacific, Russia. These countries are not rich, and there has not been a gigantic change of pattern over the last 80 years. So what does that say about economic development? Part of what we have here, folks, and part of what is really striking is that technology, and I'll show you, technology gives us new potentials as humans. You are no longer out there scurrying around trying to worry about what you're going to eat. And if you go back, and if you ever I love watching these indigenous tribe videos, these first contact videos. You see these first contact videos of people in the Amazon. They come out of the forest and they see modern people for the first time. And they're shocked, and there's like this tense moment, and they have their spear, and they're like, what are we gonna do? We're gonna fight, and they come out and they start rummaging through stuff. It's an interesting, fascinating kind of exposure that's very much paralleling what we're seeing here. But you listen to their stories, and it's like, okay, yeah, I lived in the jungle, and I slept in. I sometimes would sleep. They're sleeping not just on the ground with ants biting them at night, and they don't eat maybe once in a week, and they're hungry. They're running around trying to look for maybe a woman to capture from somebody else, and trying to make sure that their women don't get captured. And if a raider comes in, it'll just be like a murdering fight spree, and they're out there just living wild, And they describe it actually as a very uncomfortable state. Sort of like you can imagine the animals out there trying to figure out what they're going to eat next, sleeping out in the rain, right? We have escaped this long stretch of human history where we worry about things like famine, where there's no famine worry here in the United States. Our food production far exceeds our own needs, right? That's not true in all countries. In China, they don't have that. They need to rely on the world to produce. But the point is that technology gave us these potentials, and yet at the same time, we see technology rapidly expanding the human possibilities of the human race. But these possibilities and these benefits are not shared, and they haven't been shared equally. There has not been a pattern of development that has been pulling out mass groups of people, that's been sort of drastically changing GDP per capita across the world. The pattern is stable. It points in some ways to somewhat of what I would think of as, so far, technology's failed to reach its promise to the human race in general. Right? That's how I would think about it. Now, will it in the future? Interesting. That's up to you guys going forward. That's up to, going forward. You are that's why I said you need to recognize the state of your existence. Where were you born in the state of human existence in time? You were born during a time of rapidly expanding technologies that give you world potentials, and now will we achieve those? I don't know. Politics and all kinds of things getting into it, right? Let's go back to the slides. We see where wealth's concentrated. That's the big point. We see it hasn't changed. So looking at the economic history of things, I like to always think back. Like I said, think back to these primitive times. First innovations of fire, first innovations of social organization, innovations of market. You can think about all the different innovations we've experienced. And what I was talking about before, about living like as an animal, right? You think about the better tribes in the jungle, the better tribes, the ones that are not, we're out there fending for yourself. You've got a tribe, you've got some social organization, There's some benefits. You learn things like fire. You have some type of basic innovations. Maybe even you learned about metals. You had a metal age. You had all these different types of technological innovations that maybe brought us through the Stone Age, from the Bronze Age, you know, and Iron Ages. And now you're in a more, even a larger society. You even think of things like the Aztecs or the Mayas or the Egyptians. All of these types of big civilizations of people, they still face things like famine. Okay. Famines could come through. You read the Bible, famines talked about all over the place. That was the reality of the time. So it's not social organization or other things that allow you to escape that. And this is actually a model called the Malthusian trap, where you have food production and you get population growth. And at some point, this critical point where your population growth sort of outpaces your food production, you find yourself in catastrophe. Okay. And so what happens then? You get catastrophe, downward pressures towards population. Populations dive until you're below your food production capacity, and then they'll start to rise again. And once they rise past the capacity again, crash, fall down, and then come down below the capacity and rise and crash like this. This is the kind of dynamic that you see out there with things like predators and prey, right? Overpopulations of predators, they kill off all the prey. Now they starve, predators die, the prey sort of reproducing, the food supply comes back up, predators come up again. It's this cyclical thing happening. And this is the thing, this is the dynamic that was governing our entire human existence. Why do we have things like famines? Okay. Thinking about the technology of things, look at what's different. How many man hours would it take to pick a field and process that field? I'm not sure. Have you ever watched a farming video? It's incredible. You get these things that combines cutting swaths of earth as wide as this classroom, going like 30 miles an hour. It's picking the corn, it's shucking it, it's pulling the kernels off the I don't call the thing, not the husk, but the middle of it, and dekerneling it. And there's a conveyor belt with this arm that's just shooting raw kernel corn into a truck driving right next to the combine. And they're doing this thing at like 20 miles an hour. At the same time, it's taking what's left over, grinding it up and tilling the ground and putting the material back in the ground. Doing what would take literally tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of man hours. And you've got 3 people running the show. You see? The big wake up here is technology delivered us from this trap. And you see it happening here. So this is a big history of world economic development. This is income per person for the base year of 1800. And you see this Malthusian trap happening. You see? The cyclical thing happening from negative 1000 BC all the way to the current period. And then you see income per person, blow up. I've already given you the spoiler of why this happened. What happened at that point? It says it right there. Industrial Revolution. We had the creation of steam turning into mechanical power, rotary power. You have gears. I was going to show you a thing on gears. You familiar with the leverage? Leverage. Say, give me a lever long enough, I could move the earth, Leverage. It's actually the principle behind gears. You actually have a bunch of little tiny, every tooth is like a little lever. You can take lower power and spin it up to higher power. You all have experienced it if you rode like a 10-speed bike. You go up a hill, you can throw it on an easy route with little energy, power. And so you can take rotary power and transform it into all different varieties of power. years, peers and engines coming together for industrial revolution to happen. Okay, so here is a 2,000-year history, except cross-country now. Before I just gave you the world, right? With like a 3,000 or 4,000-year history. Here's a 2,000-year history cross-country. What do you notice at the birth of Christ? How'd the world look? Again, let's look at this. This is just raw GDP. This is not per capita now. It's important you keep in mind the measurements, per capita or total raw levels. Talk about raw levels of output now. What do you notice? So you read this as a slice in the time period. And it's showing you the different countries, share of that slice. The birth of Christ, who was the largest country, GDP-wise? Looks like India, right? India and China. China was big, right? You got a ton of people there. All right? So think, without technology, your production is driven by manpower. You don't have horsepower, you have manpower. And so production, it's no surprise here. You've got the most populous places in the world producing most of the stuff. It seems pretty obvious why that's the case. And then you have smaller populations, industrial revolution happening, and you have the share of total GDP production clearly swinging to these industrialized countries. Okay, starting off, you see that this is the UK. Starting off with a divergence happening, 1700s, England is the first to start that divergence. Okay, followed by the US. Came to grow more in the 20th century. We'll talk about that. And now towards the end of, not the end of, yeah, I guess at the end of the 20th century, you see the second trend, which is the total share of global output in terms of China is growing tremendously. That share of world GDP is now expanding a ton again, while shares of production in the developed countries are all kind of falling. These are the trends we see. And now you can see actually in 2017 the share of GDP. And this is a different type of price adjustment. I didn't talk to you about it. It's called PPP. This is purchase power parity. We will talk about this in more detail. This is an adjustment for costs of things that, so it's like you have a certain amount of production, but guess what? Actually, it's like the exchange rates all matter, but also the purchase power in those local places matter. So if I give you $10,000 here, you can't buy a ton of stuff. $10,000 in some countries will buy you a ton. See? So the PPP adjustment is to adjust, again, you get price distortions because we care about real stuff. And the real stuff, the distortion in prices here is with the purchase power. It's like purchase power parity, equality, parity. Making those adjustments, actually, China's got 23 trillion compared to the US output of 19. China's the largest economy in purchase power parity GDP totals, okay? Not in GDP per person. That's a different metric. They got a lot of people. They produce a lot of stuff. They're the biggest economy, but not in terms of development yet. So here's another slide. This is a video, and I think this is a really interesting video. This is from 1800. This will show you in video speed now. All these countries, these top 15 countries, from 1800 to 2040. So actually it does a projection at the end. I think it stops in like 2019 or 2019 or 2020 is when the data set stops, and then it does like future projections. Let's go ahead and watch. So China big, India big, right? A lot of people. We also have had industrial revolution happening right now. And so you see, you'll see the UK starting to come up in rank. UK is coming up in rank. A little slow. Could do this a little faster, right? England really took off in terms of they had a huge trading arm, the East Indian Trading Company, that was sort of the arm, their economic arm globally that established a lot of this colonial types of, colonized a lot of countries. Now you have the U.S. really kind of joining in. You see the U.S. jumped up big in the mid-1800s. Got the expansion out west. Remember, there's a whole expansion out west. Remember our own history. You had a lot of things actually happening, blooming up. The West Coast was blooming up right around then. The nation was just this big, huge resource mass. At the same time, we had technological innovation, and we're sitting there neck and neck with England at this time. Then what you'll see is we really start shooting up. And we're coming into the next century, into the 20th century, which in the first part of it, we have wars. World War I was about to happen. But before that happens, even we're starting to take off. Our industrial base, it's like we had the expansion out west, we had an industrialization. It took us a while to kind of get geared up and get industrialized. Well, our industrial engine is kicking now. We actually are a lot bigger country than a country like England. So although we have the same technology, our resource abundance, our population, our attitude of expansion, our attitude of moving out west, this pioneering attitude, causing like us to really push our innovation cycles. 1914, 15, okay, so you got wars happening. China, the dynasty falls. Last dynasty, last emperor of China. And you're going to see us really take off in the depression. The depression's about to happen here. And you'll see everything kind of shrink in. Here we go, we're shrinking in. We get depression, and then comes war. Okay, so you'll see Germany, the war machine's probably just kicking up. Second World War starts, and you see all the other countries are getting battered by war, while we are insulated from being bombed. Our factories are getting geared into war production. Our industrial complex, we've had industrial development, and everyone else's industries are decimated, and we take off and establish ourselves as world leaders in the global economy. We leave everybody in the dust. 50s, 60s, we're still just miles ahead. Russia at the same time, we got Cold War. Russia's like struggling with their development. Got this battle between East and West, between communism and open society. Russia's really making a run at it. There's a lot of this stuff going on during this time period. You see Japan's rising. Japan actually had done a lot of innovations in Japanese industry. There were some Americans that went over there and actually helped the Japanese develop things.
of continual quality improvements. They took industrialization super serious. You have a Japanese success story in the 80s. From the 80s, all the electronics were being made in Japan. A lot of cars were being made in Japan. And actually, U.S. production of things was looked at as almost second rate starting out there. Japanese quality was extremely good. And China, being right neighbors with Japan, benefits directly from those Japanese innovations. They're neighbors. They can start to borrow those technologies shorthand. Along with Taiwan, by 2003, a big event happens. I got to stop it here. 2003, China joins the WTO. So in 1997, the Chinese Communist Party opens China to the world. So before 1979, before 1979, China was closed, totally closed. In 79, they start to open. The process continues. They're opening, they're inviting new technology. You've got all these industrialists going over there, making tons of money. Look at the pictures of all these people that, were building projects, building rails, building in the factories. All this sort of stuff was happening. All these multinationals in the 90s start to go abroad. There's a multinationalism expansion in the 90s, an explosion of these multinational corporations, and they're taking advantage of the fact that you get really low wages that they can pay in other countries. And so there was a huge investment from the United States that happened in the late 90s, in the 2000s, early 2000s, where there was a lot of investment, US investment into the Chinese market in the form of like, hey, let's go make a factory over there. Let's go start making production over there. When you bring your factory, you also bring your technology. Okay, so at the same time, China is starting to just rapidly develop from these kind of technological transfers that were happening. And then in 2003, China joins the WTO, which is a whole nother like level of opening up. And there's at the same time a lot more influx. They see this opening up as like, hey, this is a good sign. China's like modernizing. There's a lot of hope that China was going to just politically also modernize in terms of opening their society. That didn't happen, which is what the trade war was about. But we see all this happening. And now with this new open injection of all technologies of things, watch China, okay? Watch the speed. 2007, 2008, I'll tell you when I moved there. I moved to China right now. That's when I moved to China, right there. I was in China all during this period. So right there. It's currently where I think the data stops, so I'll stop it there. You see where I was at China during a time when it was rapidly expanding. But I think that the interesting part is when you saw that expansion of the US and that separation of the US and the world, you saw the China story just shooting up at like million Mach speed, catching up and then jumping past us in terms of total output. Not per capita, but that's all there. What do you all think about that video? Did it give you like a little different global perspective? Hopefully. This is just data. This is what we see. Interesting. Okay. Okay, so now let's look back. So I'm giving you all kinds of different perspectives on growth, okay? Another perspective here is in the US, we can look at from, remember we saw 1900 to 2016. You saw that that's when the US really just jumped off, mainly in the 50s or two. And what you see is that there was this eightfold per capita, an eightfold increase. That means Americans can get 8 times more stuff at the end of the period than they did at the beginning of the period. There's an expansive growth in our wealth and our nation during that time period. That's important to know. Okay, these are patterns that you all need to know in terms of like what are the patterns of things. Okay. So now let's look at the nitty-gritty and the determinants. We've already touched on this. The determinants. What makes growth happen like this? What supercharges an economy? And the metric that we can use to look at this is a simple one. It's labor productivity. Labor productivity is a simple measure of how much output per worker. How much does a worker produce? And again, you can think about the farmer on the tractor, how much corn does he pick on his tractor versus he's out there picking it in the field, right? That's labor productivity. You have one farmer. So if he picked a field of corn by himself, that would be one farmer for a field of corn, right? It took 100 people to pick that field, then that's a tenth. Oh, sorry, 100. That's a hundredth, right? What am I thinking? Those people are 100 times less productive. So labor productivity is our metric that we're focusing on, and it's just this output. This is output GDP divided by labor. You got to know how to calculate that. And so that's our measure of this is the result of technology, obviously. And so we can measure and look at the result and then use that as a starting point. So this is like the evidence of technology, right? That's how productive your labor is. So let's look at the things that actually drive that metric. It's all going to be technology related, every bit of it, just in different ways. So think about technology central, capital. Okay, so in the farmer example, what's the capital? Capital is what? It's the part of the production that doesn't get consumed in the production as much, which is things like in the farmer example, capital would be like what? The tractor. Or in the lower technology sort of field of things, it might be the, what's the thing called, the reaper tool. What's that? I forget what it's called. Sorry, what is it called? Scythe. And the scythe. Or the hoe, the shovel or something. Those kind of tools, right? Capital is, it also includes things like buildings, but even a building has things, technologies, there's building technology. Capital is distinguished from technology by a lot of economists. But in a way, capital itself is an embodiment of technology. It's something that's been embodied in technology that's used in production that doesn't diminish with production that much. I mean, tractor might rust, that's called depreciation. Okay. There's also another kind of capital. So capital is this thing that doesn't degrade in production. This other kind of capital called human capital. Human capital is like the knowledge that you have, right? Your education gives you human capital. Your knowledge that you have allows you to be able to do things that you maybe couldn't do before. So, and this also persists over time. Like my PhD is with me for the rest of my life, right? I've got this. I got my human capital. I have this. Of course, I have to keep updating myself because I'm in a technological field. And that can depreciate too. So we have capital driving labor productivity, physical and human capital. There's also this technological change. This just seems so almost inseparable, but they are all linked. It's separated because what they're showing here is that you have a certain amount of capital. Okay, that's what you have. But then there's also innovation, making the next wave happen. And it's actually that next wave, that new creation of new knowledge, new innovation, new types of technologies. That's really at the heart of what's driving everything forward. And so we're going to break this down in a lot of ways. First off, you think about in terms of our society, the role of the entrepreneur, the role of the Elon Musk out there, right? The entrepreneur is going out and creating the next wave of new technologies of space vehicles that can be reused and launched into new types of realms of, take us into new realms of possibilities. right? Also, just different types of AI programs we develop, all these kind of new innovations in material technologies that make goods that give us all kinds of different uses. Now you got tires that don't pop and all kinds of things. So there's this innovation that's happening, driven a lot by these entrepreneurs. And so now I want us to start to think about like how are these things actually, like what's driving it? The entrepreneur is obviously like one of the central forces here in our markets. And so think about the things that are going to, you can think about the things that can promote the entrepreneur to come up with new ideas and the things that might constrain it. And that's actually partly where some of these financial constraints might come into effect, right? Like having a good idea, it doesn't mean squat if you can't do something with the idea. Actually having the idea doesn't mean a dang thing. You got to actually do the idea to make it worth something. How do you do big ideas? Well, you need to typically have access to money. So you need to have some kind of financing mechanism to get yourself some money to make your ideas happen. And we have financial markets and we have different types of lending institutions that help. What does a lending institution do? It takes all of your individual deposits, pulls them into a central place where now they're a big deposit. And now we're a place where people can come with big ideas and make their ideas into bigger realities. You see the link in the financial markets, what we have there, the banking, the type of things. Those are innovations that we have, social innovations that help to promote entrepreneurs to create new ideas. Okay, that's there. Behind all that, we also have institutions. So when you have a new idea, what does an institution do? Well, things like legal institutions. Okay, legal institutions. How well is your intellectual property that so you created something? You know what IP is? Intellectual property. Things like patents, trademarks. I have a new idea. I write up the design. I submit it. I get a patent, or I get something like this. I make a trademark. I have some new intellectual property, and now I own it, right? So why does that benefit me? Because now I can go off and I can charge people a price because I'm the only person that's allowed to use this technology. I have the rights for a certain period of time to be the only seller of this technology. I own it. So I get returns. Now, if there's no intellectual property protection rights, then why would I innovate? There's no incentive. If I go innovate, you just go steal my idea. I never get to get it. So I put all this energy into innovation. I put all this time and energy into it. And you're going to steal my idea. Sell a what do they call it? Fugazi, a fake, right? To sell a knockoff or steal the technology. There's no benefits for innovation. Now, what was the trade war about? I'll tell you directly from the White House, who I was talking to at the time. It was about IP, intellectual property, about the failure of Chinese legal institutions in protecting U.S. property, U.S. intellectual property from being stolen and copied. There was a lot of weakness. They tried to bolster it up. They made a big thing about it over there. They actually did clean up some things. When I first got there, you could literally get anything fake. They actually had a fake market, a silk streak market, where you could get anything knockoff, walk in there and get everything knockoff. And they shut a lot of those different things down. So they did a lot of that kind of shutdown. They tried to make some efforts. But at the same time, there was still just a lot of bigger sort of technologies, like production types of technologies, where companies were starting to feel shafted. And when you're shafted and you're in China, you got shafted, you got somebody who's taking your technologies, they're pushing you. The thing is that legal institutions don't give you a way to fight back. That's what you don't have in China. The government says that you're going to transfer technology, or that's part of the deal, and all of a sudden, hey, guess what? I heard this from people. They say, okay, guess what? Hey, I'm your business partner. I'm going to let you have a 6% profit now, and I'm going to have your factory, right? What are you going to do? There's no institution there you can stand on. And we actually, I could go into it, but we don't protect our own abroad. I feel like we want to have this trade war. Actually, if we just took our legal institutions and we said every single American in the world is guaranteed a certain set of rights, every single business that's founded here will be taken up by our institutions. In other words, our courts will hear those cases. Our courts will not hear those cases because they happened in China. They say, we don't have jurisdiction. We have this idea about the world of like, if you're in Rome, yeah, you're over there. We're not going to do anything much about it. Our courts won't take jurisdiction. You see? Actually, I think we could have done a heck of a lot more, had a bigger impact had we just said, okay, we're going to guarantee it. And okay, we're going to hold people accountable here in our courts if you violate us in any way. We're not going to rely on your courts to do it. If your courts aren't going to do it, we'll do it. We didn't do that. I don't know why. It's driving me nuts. But institutions matter. You get the point? They either promote innovation or they constrain innovation. Okay. So one of the ideas that came out before, this was like going back a little ways about like why are some countries rich and others poor, is there's this idea is that, you know, capital differences were accounting for these things. You get poor countries, they just don't have much capital. They don't have much, you know, investment and these type of things. It actually turned out that capital was not able to explain these kind of income differences in the end. That's what the findings of research told us. But capital is still obviously a very important thing, and it's one of the things that's driving labor productivity. So it is a factor. Not the factor, but it is a factor, okay? Financial institutions, we talked about these things. I'm going to skip through this a little bit. I'm not going to go, maybe I'll return back to financial systems. Again, financial systems, financial institutions being the part that's actually helping to promote capital creation, promote investment, also promote innovation through these things. There's actually an accounting exercise here. You're not responsible for how, so I'm going to show you what you're not responsible for. I'm not going to hold you responsible for what they call this derivation. They're going to show you that investment is equal to savings. It's an accounting identity. You can start with GDP here, and you can say a closed economy. This means that a closed economy is an economy where there's no trade. Okay, so they just cut exports out of that equation to make it simple. You can rewrite, and I'm not going to go through, this is called a derivation. It's an accounting identity exercise that has this result, that your savings is equal to your investments by necessity, by accounting definitions. Okay. So savings is, and this is the big takeaway, is that the savings rates become sort of critical in understanding how patterns of investment will be. Does that settle in? I'm just telling you some things. I hope this settles in. Savings is equal investment. That's something you're responsible for. That's something you need to understand. Because what we can look at then is look at savings rates by country and start to get an idea about investment. What do you notice? Savings being darker, right? Darker the more savings. I think this is gross domestic savings as a percentage of their production. So think about their production. Like you make some stuff, you make some corn, you know, you eat some corn, you consume some of it, and then you save some. So the basic identity is you make some stuff, and you either are going to eat it or save it. That's the idea. And so we look at the percentage that people are saving. In China, again, through a lot of Africa, there's a lot higher savings rates. A lot of this, I can tell you, is because there's not social safety nets in some of these places. So what does it mean to be poor? It means that you could randomly die from something that costs $10 to fix. That's what it means. That's what poverty means. It means it means you're taking a lottery every day if you're going to live or die from something really, really cheap. So what do? You make sure you have that $10. You're not going to not have it, right? But savings rates you see are higher in these kind of places with, again, more. You can also look at capital formation by country. These are all patterns. And again, it's not a surprise. You see a lot of capital formation in China, through Africa, places where there were high savings rates. One of the things about capital formation that we need to think about is the quality of the investments. This is something that's going to, so we're going to see investments driving business cycles. And all the time, I want us to stop and think about like what kind of investment, what kind of capital is being created during these cycles. Like in the 2008, what kind of capital did we create with lower interest rates? We created a lot of housing. It wasn't the kind of capital that was putting in production purposes in terms of like new factories and things like this. It wasn't building our industrial capacity, it was building up our housing capacity. So investment can take it, remember, it's buildings and furnitures and all sorts of other things. And if we're going to really be serious about understanding what kind of capital creation is going on in a certain period of window of time, when we look at it, when we go to business cycles, we need to stop and pause and think about the type of capital. That's the point. The quality of it. What time do we have here? Huh? 8:50. And we're ending at 9. All right, I talked a lot. I'm trying to think if we want to jump. We did a lot of stuff here, and I think what I'll do is, let me do this. I'll just end here, and then what I'll do, because we're going to jump into the next section, let me just give you a preview of things. So now you can at least just, I'd like you to read the slides going forward, and you can have a preview of what we're looking at. It's this idea of technology, and I want you to think about, first off, how do they get it? You create it. You can also transfer it and get it from other people. You can take it, right? You can steal it. And we're going to dive into the things that go into creating technology. And within that idea will be a separate idea that there's 2 separate components of technological creation. That you're going to have a component of know-how, of scientific, like, oh, yeah, guess what? Like, heat makes steam out of water. That's scientific knowledge, right? And then at this other time, at the other part, you also have designs. So for the steam engine, you had to know the science behind how to create steam. That's scientific knowledge. Have the science behind how to make metal. But then you had to have the design part. There's a research part and a development part. Development for the design, research for the scientific knowledge. And we're going to look at these in some detail in this next section. I'd like you to read it, though, keeping that in mind, okay?